Not even her dog. It's my dog! She's taking my dog!
James Maitland Stewart, a native of Indiana, Pennsylvania, embodied the spirit of Main Street America. His hometown, far removed from the bustling cities of Philadelphia or nearby Pittsburgh, lies in western Pennsylvania, a region steeped in the legacy of the American frontier of the early 1800s. Stewart's family had a proud tradition of military service. Both of his grandfathers were Civil War veterans, and his father served in the Spanish-American War. As a boy, Stewart aspired to a military career, but his father discouraged the idea. A shy and introverted child, he spent much of his time building model airplanes, a passion he carried into adulthood. Stewart's fascination with aviation began early. He took his first airplane ride at age 12, shortly after World War I, when a barnstorming pilot visited his town. His father's successful hardware business afforded the family financial stability and political connection. At 16, Stewart was enrolled in the prestigious Mercersburg Academy, a college preparatory school in southern Pennsylvania. While at home recovering from an illness, he witnessed Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic flight, achieved in a plane designed by Mercersburg alumnus Benjamin Franklin Mahoney. Initially, Stewart dreamed of attending the U.S. Naval Academy to become a Navy pilot, but his father had other plans. In 1928, Stewart enrolled at Princeton University, where he discovered a passion for acting. There, he became close friends with Henry Fonda, who shared his enthusiasm for model airplanes. Although Fonda was not a Princeton student, the two collaborated as part of an intercollegiate dramatic team. After graduation, they moved to New York, sharing an apartment and working on a model of a Martin bomber. When Fonda moved to Hollywood, Stewart followed, arriving by train with the model bomber in hand. Once in Hollywood, Stewart quickly immersed himself in aviation, taking flying lessons at Mines Field, now Los Angeles International Airport. He encountered several notable Hollywood figures there, including Robert Taylor, Tyrone Power, and Francis Langford, who were also aviation enthusiasts. Taylor would later serve as a Navy flight instructor during World War II. By the spring of 1941, Jimmy Stewart was not only a Hollywood star, but also an accomplished pilot. With a commercial license and over 300 flight hours logged, he owned a Stinson 105 airplane and was an investor in Thunderbird Field, a Phoenix-based training facility contracted to prepare Army pilots. Had he waited until after Pearl Harbor, Stewart's extensive civilian flying experience would have made him an ideal candidate for the Army's service pilot program, which offered commissions and non-combat pilot roles to qualified civilians. However, Stewart didn't wait. When he received his draft notice in October 1940, during the first peacetime draft, he chose to enlist. At his physical, the famously lanky actor was deemed underweight, a ruling that might have been a relief for many. For Stewart, though, it was a challenge. His sense of duty, shaped by his upbringing in America's heartland, inspired him to appeal the decision. Determined to serve, he reportedly ate bananas to tip the scales during his second weigh-in, though Stewart himself credited a friend who manned the scales. On March 22, 1941, Stewart's persistence paid off, and he officially became a private in the U.S. Army Air Corps months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The details surrounding how Jimmy Stewart earned his aeronautical rating as a military pilot remain somewhat mysterious. At 32 years old, Stewart was beyond the age limit of 27 for aviation cadet training when he was drafted. However, as a graduate of a prestigious university and a licensed commercial pilot, he met the qualifications for an officer's commission. At some point, he applied for a commission and a military pilot rating based on his civilian flying experience. His commission, dated January 19, 1942, suggests he may have been brought in under the newly established service pilot program. This program typically limited pilots to non-combat roles, but Stewart appears to have received a full military pilot rating. By that time, he had been in the Army for nearly 10 months and held the rank of corporal, stationed at Moffett Field near San Francisco. Stewart's journey to becoming a U.S. Army pilot was highly unconventional. Before World War II, becoming a rated military pilot required completing undergraduate pilot training as either an aviation cadet or a commissioned officer. In late 1941, the Army began hiring civilian pilots under contract for non-military tasks, such as ferrying aircraft. When the U.S. entered the war, many of these civilian pilots were brought into the military in limited-duty roles. Stewart, however, followed a different path. Already serving in the Army, he was evaluated and deemed competent as a military pilot without attending a formal pilot training course. Instead of ferrying aircraft or flying transports, he was assigned as an instructor pilot within the training command. His Ivy League education and demonstrated leadership potential likely played a role in his rapid progression. Despite his unconventional route, Stewart's military career stands out as a unique example of adaptability and determination. Jimmy Stewart was determined to become a combat pilot, but the Army had other plans. As a Hollywood icon, Stewart's fame made him a valuable recruiting tool, and the military initially sought to keep him in a non-combat role. Shortly after his commissioning, he was summoned to Washington, D.C., to attend President Franklin Roosevelt's March of Dimes rally and appear at various events. A Hollywood star in uniform wearing pilot wings was an ideal image for promoting enlistment in the Army Air Corps. However, Stewart, driven by patriotism, was resolute in his desire to serve as a soldier, not a celebrity mascot. Upon returning to Moffett Field, he enrolled in instrument, night, formation, and multi-engine training to bolster his qualifications for a combat assignment. After earning his multi-engine rating, Stewart was sent to Mather Field near Sacramento for instructor training as a multi-engine pilot. His next post was at Kirtland Field in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he flew twin-engine Beechcrafts carrying bombardier trainees. His duty was straightforward: fly level over the bombing range, while students practiced dropping dummy bombs using advanced bomb sights. Although routine, this experience provided Stewart with essential skills for his future role as a bomber pilot. During his free time, Stewart frequently traveled to Los Angeles to reconnect with his Hollywood friends, many of whom had also joined the military. His close friend Henry Fonda enlisted in the Navy, while Burgess Meredith, his former housemate, was training as an Army Air Force's intelligence officer. In late 1942, Stewart reunited with Clark Gable, who had recently completed officer training and was preparing for overseas deployment to produce a film for the Air Corps. In early 1943, Stewart transitioned to a new role as a four-engine instructor pilot at Gowan Field in Idaho. Before the assignment, he completed a four-engine training course in Hobbs, New Mexico, where he checked out as a first pilot or aircraft commander, flying Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. Afterward, he reported to the Combat Crew Processing Center in Salt Lake City, Utah, anticipating an assignment to a combat unit in preparation for overseas deployment. Unlike his classmates, who were recent graduates of advanced Army pilot training and received assignments to combat groups preparing for overseas deployment, Jimmy Stewart's path remained unique. As someone who had not completed the Army's standard pilot training program, his status was unconventional and somewhat ambiguous. Likely one of the first military pilots rated based on extensive civilian flying experience, Stewart appeared to have bypassed the service pilot classification, instead earning full pilot wings. Stewart was assigned to the 29th Bombardment Group in Boise, Idaho, as an instructor pilot. The 29th, which had previously conducted anti-submarine patrols in the Caribbean early in the war, had since transitioned to serving as a training group for bomber units headed to combat. Shortly after his arrival, Stewart's leadership abilities were recognized and he was promoted to captain. His new role included commanding a squadron, marking a significant step forward in his military career. After several months in Boise, Jimmy Stewart caught wind of rumors that he might be reassigned to the audiovisual service or sent on an endless war bond tour. For Stewart, who was determined to serve as an operational pilot, these whispers were the last straw. Though he had avoided leveraging his celebrity status or rank thus far, this time he decided to take action. Stewart approached Colonel Walter Arnold, the group commander, to express his frustration and reaffirm his commitment to serving in a combat role. Colonel Arnold, understanding Stewart's determination, chose to advocate for him instead of offering platitudes about the needs of the service. He recommended Stewart for a vacancy in the 445th Bombardment Group, which had recently passed through Boise and was now in the third phase of training in Sioux City, Iowa. The 703rd Bombardment Squadron needed an operations officer, a role requiring both heavy bomber expertise and command experience qualifications Stewart possessed. Having worked with the 445th earlier at Gowan Field, Stewart was already familiar to many of the group's senior officers, making him an ideal candidate for the position. Jimmy Stewart's transfer occurred during a pivotal moment for the Army Air Forces, which was phasing out the Boeing B-17 in favor of the newer consolidated B-24. Larger, faster, and with a significantly greater range than the B-17, the B-24 had become the preferred, long-range heavy bomber, especially as the Army awaited the deployment of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress in greater numbers. By late 1943, nearly all new heavy bomber groups preparing for overseas missions were being equipped with B-24s, and the remaining B-17s in the Pacific Theater were being replaced. This transition wasn't without controversy. Notable commanders like Major General James H. Doolittle strongly disagreed with the shift. Doolittle, who later commanded the 8th Air Force, Stewart's eventual assignment, argued for the continued production and use of the B-17. However, in the summer of 1943, such decisions were still unfolding, and Stewart's immediate future lay with the B-24. Though Stewart had reportedly been training pilots on B-17s, he transitioned to the B-24 upon joining the 445th Bombardment Group at Sioux City. According to author Starr Smith, who later served with Stewart in England, Stewart had not yet been checked out on the B-24 before his arrival. Nevertheless, his extensive flying experience ensured he adapted to the new aircraft with ease. As a squadron operations officer, Jimmy Stewart's primary responsibility was overseeing the air crews in his unit. He supervised the assignment and training of personnel, ensuring all crew members were proficient in their roles. When issues arose, it fell to Stewart to address them, whether by resolving the problem or reassigning crew members to form more effective teams. However, Stewart only held this position for 3 weeks before being promoted to squadron commander, a role that significantly expanded his responsibilities. As commander, Stewart was now in charge of all squadron personnel, including the enlisted ground crews who maintained the B-24s and the administrative staff responsible for records and orders. His duties encompassed maintaining discipline, ensuring morale, and executing orders from group headquarters. By November 1943, the 445th Bombardment Group had completed its training and was declared ready for operational deployment. Preparations for the invasion of Western Europe were in full swing, with the focus on defeating the Luftwaffe and securing air superiority over the invasion beaches in France. As squadron commander, Stewart did not have a crew of his own, and instead departed for Europe with Lieutenant Lloyd Sherard's crew. Sherard, an experienced pilot, had also checked Stewart out on the B-24 when he first joined the squadron in Sioux City. On November 15, 1943, Stewart and the Sherard crew departed for Europe from the Ferrying Command's departure point at Morrison Field in West Palm Beach, Florida. After arriving at Tibenham in November 1943, the 445th Bombardment Group did not immediately begin combat operations. By this point in the war, the Army Air Forces had gained nearly 2 years of combat experience and had learned the importance of a shakedown period. Newly arrived groups underwent theater indoctrination to prepare for operational missions. The 445th was assigned to the 2nd Combat Bombardment Wing, led by Brigadier General Edward J. Ted Timberlake. Timberlake, the youngest general officer in the Army, was one of the most experienced and respected B-24 commanders in the 8th Bomber Command. Having brought the 93rd Bomb Group to England in 1942 and led it in combat, including the legendary low-level raid on the Ploesti oil fields, Timberlake was a no-nonsense leader. Unlike many of his peers who were reassigned to stateside positions, Timberlake remained in Europe with the 8th Air Force for the duration of the war, commanding a combat wing and setting high standards for his officers and crews. Under Timberlake's leadership, the 445th spent more than 2 weeks flying practice missions to ensure the crews were fully prepared for combat. Stewart, along with his operations officer, personally flew with each squadron crew, speaking with every member to verify their readiness and ensure they knew their responsibilities. The 445th flew its first combat mission on December 13, 1943, targeting the U-boat pens at Kiel. Stewart led the group's high squadron, guiding them over the target at an altitude of 27,000 feet. 3 days later, on December 16th, he flew as the 445th Group's lead pilot during a mission to Bremen. On Christmas Eve, Stewart again led the group, this time against German rocket launching sites in the Pas de Calais. The mission, involving over 2,000 bombers and fighters, marked the largest 8th Air Force operation of the war up to that point. The January 7, 1944, mission to Ludwigshafen marked a turning point in Jimmy Stewart's military career, bringing him to the attention of senior officers beyond his group. Stewart was leading the 445th Bomb Group when he noticed the 389th Bomb Group, which his unit was following, veering 30 degrees off course after leaving the target area. Recognizing the error, he radioed the 389th's lead pilot to warn him, but the other officer insisted they were on the correct heading. Despite knowing the deviation exposed both groups to grave danger by separating them from the main bomber stream, Stewart decided to stay with the 389th, effectively accepting a potentially fatal risk. Stewart's fears proved correct. German radar operators detected the separated groups and vectored approximately 60 Luftwaffe fighters to intercept them south of Paris. The navigational error proved costly. The lead pilot of the 389th, whose navigator had made the mistake, was among those lost when his B-24 was shot down. Anticipating the attack, Stewart had ordered his formation to tighten up for mutual protection. His decision and leadership under fire ensured that none of his group's aircraft were lost, though 17 of the B-24s were shot down that day. By refusing to abandon the 389th and maintaining a tight defensive formation, Stewart likely saved the sister group from devastating losses. In recognition of his actions, Colonel Milton W. Arnold, commander of the 389th Bomb Group, wrote a commendation letter to Colonel Robert H. Terrell, commander of the 445th Bomb Group. Stewart's exceptional leadership and courage earned him a promotion to major shortly after the mission. The day following the Ludwigshafen mission, a significant shakeup occurred in the 8th Air Force's command structure. General Karl Spaatz, who had recently taken command of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, reassigned 8th Air Force Commander Ira Eaker to the Mediterranean theater, replacing him with Major General James H. Doolittle. The decision, for reasons never fully explained, was met with widespread disapproval. Tensions grew further when Doolittle announced an increase in the mission requirement for bomber crews, raising the number of sorties from 25 to 30. This change added to the strain on air crews already enduring grueling and dangerous missions. Many crew members in the 8th Air Force began to feel that General Doolittle was more focused on using them to further his own reputation than on their well-being. As the intensity of combat increased, so did the toll on bomber crews. The 445th Bomb Group, during its first 21 days in combat, lost 6 crews, an average of 2 per week. Within less than a month, 61 of their comrades were listed as missing in action. These casualty rates became all too common throughout the 8th Bomber Command, and as the workload grew in early 1944 in preparation for the invasion, the losses would continue to mount. In early 1944, General Spaatz and his deputy commander for operations, Major General Fred Andrews, approved Operation Argument, a massive week-long series of heavy bomber raids on Germany that would come to be known as Big Week. On the first day of the operation, Stewart flew as the deputy lead of the 2nd Bombardment Wing. Although the mission was originally planned for blind bombing using radar, the weather over the target cleared up, allowing for visual bombing. Stewart then moved into the lead position, leading his formation and earning a Distinguished Flying Cross for his efforts. Over the course of Big Week, Stewart flew 2 more missions, one to Gotha and another to Nuremberg, during which he once again led the 445th Bomb Group. In just 3 months of combat, Stewart had built a reputation not only within his squadron, but also across the group and wing. To many of the air crews, he became a kind of lucky charm. Missions where he led, whether as squadron group or wing leader, tended to be successful with good results and relatively light casualties. He was well liked by both officers and enlisted men. However, rumors began to spread that Stewart had become too important to risk on missions and that he might be transferred or grounded. In early March, the 8th Air Force launched a series of dangerous missions targeting Berlin, a city that had yet to experience American bombers. These missions were costly, with the first 2 alone resulting in over 1,000 casualties. Stewart, however, was noticeably absent from the Berlin raids until March 22, when he led the 2nd Bombardment Wing on an assault against Germany's most heavily defended target. This mission marked his 12th combat sortie. The rumors about Stewart's transfer turned out to be true, though his combat flying days were not over. He was relieved of command of the 703rd Bombardment Squadron and reassigned to the 453rd Bombardment Group at Attleboro, where he took up the position of Group Operations Officer. On March 30, 1944, he officially began his new role under the command of Colonel Ramsay Potts. Potts, who had previously led the 93rd Bombardment Group in the famous low-level attack on Ploesti, had recently assumed command of the 453rd following the loss of its original commander. Stewart's transfer was based on merit rather than fame. Potts did not request him, but the group was struggling with low morale after losing its previous commander and operations officer. Stewart's solid reputation as a combat leader who was popular with his men made him a good fit for the role, and Potts was encouraged to have him join the team by General Timberlake, who knew Stewart well. As operations officer, Stewart was responsible for planning and briefing the group's missions. While he wasn't required to fly every mission, he often flew in the group's assembly ship to oversee the formations and occasionally participated in combat missions. Unlike the air crews, he had no set quota of missions to complete before rotating home. His staff position meant he would stay overseas for as long as necessary. With the Allies preparing for the Normandy invasion and the mission tempo accelerating, Stewart flew a total of 20 confirmed missions with both the 445th and 453rd groups, missions for which he received full credit. Jimmy Stewart was undoubtedly the most famous officer to serve in a combat unit during World War II, but he was also the most publicity-averse. His decision to join the military was driven purely by patriotism, and he had no intention of using his service for personal gain, a principle he maintained throughout his life. While the media knew he was in England, serving as a squadron commander with a Liberator group, they were eager to interview him. Stewart, however, declined all interview requests and generally avoided the press. Despite his reluctance, the Army made use of his fame by issuing press releases to announce his promotions and new assignments. One such release followed his mission to Berlin, where he was quoted about the intensity of the flak and enemy fighters. When asked if the mission had been unusual, he simply replied, "Unusual? We hit Berlin, didn't we?" In June, Stewart received a promotion to lieutenant colonel. Shortly thereafter, on July 2nd, he was reassigned to the 2nd Combat Bombardment Wing headquarters as Timberlake's executive officer. In his new role, he shared an office with Lieutenant Cal Stewart, a fellow officer with no relation. Cal had come to England in 1942 with the 93rd Bombardment Group as a radio operator, but had been reassigned to the squadron's orderly room due to his civilian background as a newspaperman from Nebraska. Timberlake authorized Cal to start a group newspaper, the first military publication in the European theater. As Timberlake was promoted to brigadier general, he took Jimmy Stewart with him as his orderly, then had him commissioned and appointed as his aide. The two Stewarts became close friends, united in their loyalty to their commander. Although Jimmy Stewart's new position at headquarters meant he was no longer flying combat missions, his staff officer role did not require him to return to the United States. Nonetheless, he occasionally managed to join missions, often flying with the 389th Group, which had become the 2nd Bombardment Wing's Pathfinder Group. Equipped with modified planes featuring radar and electronic navigational tools for blind bombing, the Pathfinder squadrons led formations through cloud cover. While the Army Air Forces still maintained a pretense of daylight precision bombing, they had adopted British-developed electronic bombing methods in late 1943. Stewart also flew with his previous groups, and later with those in the 20th Bombardment Wing, though none of these missions were credited to him. When Stewart moved to Timberlake's staff, rumors circulated that he was being groomed for command of his own group. 8th Air Force Commander Doolittle later stated that had the war in Europe continued, Stewart would have likely become a group commander. However, this never came to pass. In September 1944, when Timberlake was reassigned to command the 20th Bombardment Wing, which included his old 93rd Group, Stewart went with him after a few months as Timberlake's executive officer. Stewart returned to the 2nd Bombardment Wing as operations officer. In February 1945, Stewart was promoted to full colonel and became the 2nd Bombardment Wing's chief of staff under Colonel Milton. Arnold, who had taken notice of Stewart's leadership during the incident with the 389th Group nearly a year earlier, Stewart's rise from buck private to full colonel in just 4 years, was an extraordinary achievement accomplished by only a few men. The only other Hollywood figure who reached a similar rank in combat service was producer Marion Cooper, who flew in World War I and returned to active duty as a colonel at the start of World War II. Cooper served with Claire Chennault in China and held a staff position in the Southwest Pacific. By February 1945, Stewart was still with the 2nd Bombardment Wing as the war in Europe drew to a close. After Colonel Timberlake was replaced by Colonel Arnold in August 1944, Stewart assumed the role of Arnold's operations officer in December. When Stewart was further promoted in February 1945, it marked another key step in his rise through the ranks. Just 3 days after VE Day, Stewart succeeded Arnold as commander of the 2nd Bombardment Wing. With the war's end, Stewart's new responsibility was overseeing the demobilization of the 2nd Bombardment Wing and organizing the return of its personnel to the United States for separation or reassignment to the Pacific. He held this position for only about 4 weeks. While Star Smith suggests that Stewart continued in command until the wing was transferred back to the U.S. in September, official records show that he was replaced in June. The specifics of his role until he sailed back to the U.S. aboard the Queen Elizabeth remain unclear. After the war, Stewart continued his service in the U.S. Army Reserve, transitioning to the Air Force Reserve in 1947 when the Air Force became an independent service. He served as Deputy Director of Operations with the Strategic Air Command. In 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower nominated Stewart for promotion to Brigadier General, but the nomination was blocked by Congresswoman Margaret Chase Smith of Maine. 2 years later, after Stewart was reassigned from the Strategic Air Command to the Air Force Office of Information at the Pentagon, his promotion was finally approved. In 1968, shortly before his retirement, Stewart flew his final combat mission as an observer on a B-52 mission over Vietnam. The following year, his stepson, Marine Lieutenant Ronald McLean, was killed in action in Vietnam. In recognition of his service, President Ronald Reagan promoted Stewart to the retired rank of Major General. His military honors included 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 4 Air Medals. Jimmy Stewart not only avoided wartime publicity, but also chose not to discuss his military service publicly after the war, instructing his publicists to refrain from mentioning it. He declined offers to star in war films, believing that they did not capture the true essence of his experiences. The closest he came to a war movie was the 1955 film Strategic Air Command, where he portrayed Lieutenant Colonel Dutch Holland, a World War II B-24 pilot, though the film was set in the 1950s Air Force. Stewart did, however, have a strong interest in aviation and starred in several films with aviation themes, including Spirit of St. Louis, which depicted Charles Lindbergh's pioneering transatlantic flight. Despite keeping his wartime service private, Stewart remained in touch with many of his fellow veterans and attended reunions. At his funeral in 1997, a representative of the 8th Air Force delivered a tribute. Thanks for watching. If you have a favorite memory of James Stewart, drop a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button on your way out.